think you know Vietnam War cinema? Apocalypse Now, Platoon, Full Metal Jacket? Forget everything. Hollywood's blockbuster war machine buried over a dozen brutal, unflinching masterpieces so deep in the vault that most film fans have never even heard of them. These aren't forgotten because they sucked. They're forgotten because they were too raw, too angry, and too damn real for mainstream audiences. Today, we're excavating the cinema graveyard to expose the Vietnam War films that terrified studios, baffled critics, and deserved to be on your watch list yesterday. Ready to see what Hollywood wanted you to forget? Number 1. Death Dream, 1974. Imagine a horror film so viciously anti-war that it had to disguise itself as a vampire movie just to get made. Director Bob Clark created an undead nightmare that remains the most psychologically devastating Vietnam allegory ever shot, and hardly anyone knows it exists. A soldier gets killed in combat, but his mother refuses to accept his death. That same night, Andy Brooks shuffles through the front door, very much alive, but utterly wrong. This isn't supernatural theatrics, it's the literal personification of every parent's worst fear, their child coming home from war as a hollow shell. The genius stroke? Andy doesn't just look dead. He needs human blood to survive, representing the predatory emptiness that war carved out of his soul. Tom Savini's legendary special effects work made Andy's gradual decomposition absolutely nauseating, the slow rotting of hope itself. Critics initially dismissed it, but scholars now recognize Death Dream as a profound meditation on PTSD years before that terminology was common. The family dynamics shatter like glass throughout the film, with parents fractured between denial and acceptance, while their son sits in a rocking chair, staring into the void of his own extinction. Made in 1972 but released in '74, Death Dream arrived when America was exhausted by the actual war, making it the perfect film at the perfect moment nobody wanted to watch it. The ending still haunts. No heroic redemption, no warm homecoming, just a coffin in Arlington Cemetery and a mother's broken wails echoing across the stone. This is horror that actually means something. Number 2. Welcome Home, Soldier Boys, 1971. 4 Green Berets return stateside, expecting a hero's welcome, and instead get treated like disease carriers. Director Richard Compton crafted a relentless pressure cooker that builds devastating tension through agonizing slowness and American indifference. Joe Don Baker leads the squad as Danny, and his performance radiates contained rage so convincing it feels documentary real. The film opens with these combat veterans buying a used Cadillac to drive across the country toward California, imagining themselves as rebels on holiday. Within hours, they pick up a hitchhiker, and a routine roadside encounter turns lethal in seconds. A woman ends up thrown from the car, doing 60 miles per hour. She's dead. The squad moves on like nothing happened. This casual cruelty isn't sadism, it's the spiritual death of soldiers who learn to kill and can't switch it off. Every town treats them worse. Every interaction sparks violence. By the time they reach New Mexico, something inside them snaps completely. In the film's infamous climax, the vets transform an entire village into a war zone, fortifying buildings, setting traps, and blowing away anyone who gets close. The National Guard rolls in with helicopters and heavy artillery. These boys shoot down a chopper with a rocket launcher and transform a sleepy New Mexico town into downtown Saigon. The government responds with chemical weapons. Compton never flinches from the madness. The bluegrass soundtrack amplifies the heartbreak. These are broken American kids turned into monsters by a war nobody understands. Critics hated it, audiences avoided it. Now it's a cult artifact that predicted Vietnam vetsploitation years before Rambo made it commercial. Number 3. Tracks, 1976. Dennis Hopper gives one of his finest performances in a film so unhinged and experimental that it barely qualifies as traditional narrative cinema. Director Henry Jaglom creates something fractured and dreamlike, a cross-country train journey that becomes a descent into psychotic breakdown. Hopper plays Sergeant Jack Phelan, a Vietnam vet tasked with escorting the coffin of a dead friend from the East Coast to California for burial. The film was literally shot on actual Amtrak trains without permission, and the crew was repeatedly ejected and forced to relocate. That guerrilla chaos bleeds directly into the finished film. Jack meets Dean Stockwell's mysterious passenger Mark and falls into an impossible love with a college girl named Stephanie. But every romantic moment gets violently interrupted by combat flashbacks. Is he hallucinating? Are the other passengers real? Is the coffin even real? Jaglom refuses to clarify. The dialogue feels improvised and rambling. Conversations start and stop mid-sentence, and reality fragments with each passing hour on the train. Hopper's performance captures PTSD as a constant state of unraveling, sweating, paranoid, disconnected. He runs through the train completely naked. He stares into space for endless minutes. He's a living corpse pretending to be alive. The film ends in absolute devastation. No tidy resolution, no healing. Just a man finally coming apart at the seams. Tracks earned a respectable 6.3 on IMDb, but remains virtually unseen. Critics were confused, audiences were disturbed. Tarantino would later reference it in his work. This is one of the most authentically damaged depictions of veteran trauma ever committed to celluloid. Number 4. Rolling Thunder, 1977. Paul Schrader wrote this cult masterpiece in the same fever dream period when he scripted Taxi Driver. This isn't a conventional revenge film, it's a philosophical statement about how war transforms men into nothing beings who exist only for violence. William Devane plays Major Charles Rain, a POW returning after 7 years in a Vietnamese prison. He comes home to a family that barely remembers him. His wife has built a completely new life. His son doesn't recognize him. Nobody cares that he survived. When home invaders murder his entire family, Rane doesn't spiral into traditional revenge. He simply shifts his purpose toward destruction. He meets up with fellow vet Johnny Voden, played by a shockingly young Tommy Lee Jones in one of his first roles. The two communicate almost telepathically, both understanding that the war never ends. It just relocates. Rane gets a prosthetic hook for his severed hand, and director John Flynn frames it as a weapon rather than a disability. The hook becomes iconic, a literal manifestation of how war weaponizes everything, even your own body. Quentin Tarantino loved this film so much, he named his distribution company Rolling Thunder Pictures. The minimalist approach makes every scene devastating. Rane sits on park benches wearing sunglasses, completely emotionless. He walks through the world like an alien observing a species he no longer belongs to. The violence, when it explodes, is biblical in scale. Rane and Voden wage a one-man war against organized crime, but it's just theater for two men who've already died. Critics respected it, but audiences ignored it. This remains one of the most uncompromising portraits of how war hollows out the soul. Number 5. Hair, 1979. Milos Forman directed this psychedelic musical adaptation of the Broadway phenomenon, and it remains vastly underrated as a Vietnam War commentary. Instead of combat footage or soldier trauma, Forman focuses on the cultural schism Vietnam created in American society. John Savage plays Claude Hooper Bukowski, a naive Oklahoma farm boy drafted into the Army who arrives in New York City expecting to ship out to Southeast Asia. In Central Park, he encounters George Berger, played with charismatic anarchic energy by Treat Williams, leading a tribe of hippies engaged in permanent rebellion. Claude falls in love with Sheila, an upper-class debutante played by Beverly D'Angelo, and gets caught between his patriotic duty, hippie liberation, and personal desire. The songs are legendary: Aquarius, Let the Sunshine In, I Got Life. But the film uses them to argue that American society is fundamentally broken. Choreographer Twyla Tharp created jaw-dropping sequences that function like visual arguments against the military-industrial complex. The climax devastates. Berger accidentally gets shipped to Vietnam in Claude's place and dies in combat, turning the entire film into a tragedy about how the war destroyed the generation that questioned it. Made in 1979, a full 4 years after Saigon fell, Foreman had the distance to examine what the counterculture failed to prevent. The film earned $38 million worldwide, making it commercially successful but artistically forgotten. Critics called it frivolous nostalgia. Younger viewers found it alien. Now it plays as a stunning requiem for a failed revolution. Number 6, The Quiet American, 2002. Wait, this was 2002, but Michael Caine and Brendan Fraser inhabit a 1950s colonial Vietnam filming location so authentic it functions as a ghost story about the war's historical roots. Adapted from Graham Greene's prophetic novel, the film explores how American interventionism began decades before the actual war. Caine plays a burnt-out British journalist who witnesses American CIA operatives beginning covert operations in Indochina. Fraser plays Alden Pyle, an idealistic American agent who believes American involvement will prevent communist expansion. The love triangle between them over a Vietnamese woman creates narrative tension, but the real tension is historical. Greene's novel accurately predicted everything that would go catastrophically wrong. Caine delivers a quietly devastating performance, a man who watches the machinery of American imperialism engage with perfect futility. The film transforms beautiful Vietnamese locations into a premonition of violence. Nothing gets solved, nothing improves. American good intentions pave the road to hell. The cinematography captures colonial decay, urban density, and personal despair simultaneously. For a 2002 film, it functions as a prequel text explaining how America stumbled into the greatest foreign policy disaster of the century. Most Vietnam War films start after the war begins. The Quiet American begins in the genesis of the tragedy. Number 7, Cutter's Way, 1981. Ivan Passer directed this neo-noir thriller about a Vietnam vet seeking justice for a murdered young woman. Jeff Bridges plays Bone, while John Hurd plays Cutter, an amputee vet who lost an arm and an eye in the war. Cutter becomes obsessed with proving that a wealthy businessman committed the murder, and his quest transforms into a destructive vendetta that consumes both veterans. The film operates as both mystery thriller and meditation on how the war destroyed the capacity for normal emotional response. Cutter's disability isn't treated as sympathetic, it's treated as enraging. He channels his fury into obsession. The cinematography reflects the fractured consciousness of trauma, with scenes lit in amber and shadow, reality becoming unreliable. Bridges delivers a remarkably restrained performance as Bone watches his friend disintegrate into vengeance. The ending subverts expectation. There's no triumph, no justice, only more destruction. Cutter's Way earned modest critical attention but failed at the box office, likely because audiences expected a conventional thriller. Instead, they got philosophical despair. The film remains a masterclass in how to use noir conventions to examine psychological damage. Number 8, In Country, 1989, Bruce. Willis rarely gets credit for dramatic depth, but in this film, he embodies the spiritual devastation of veteran withdrawal. Samantha Lee Allen plays a teenage girl whose father died in Vietnam before she was born, and she becomes determined to understand the war that took him. Willis plays her uncle, a vet struggling with PTSD decades after combat ended. The film addresses the shocking reality that many veterans literally could not process their experiences, burying themselves in silence and alcohol. Willis's performance captures someone who's present physically but absent in every emotional sense. The young girl's search for answers about her dead father becomes a mirror reflecting the uncle's unprocessed grief. The film refuses easy sentimentality. By the end, nobody has truly healed. They've just learned to carry the weight slightly differently. In Country arrived at a moment when America was beginning to acknowledge that Vietnam didn't end in 1975. It continued haunting the nation through every veteran suffering in isolation. Number 9. Elia Kazan's The Visitors, 1972. Director Elia Kazan examined how Vietnam created a culture of violence that followed soldiers home. James Woods and Patrick McVeigh play former soldiers who visit their commanding officer's home after being discharged. The visit turns predatory. They assault the officer's daughter, enacting domination they learned in combat. The film refuses to judge the veterans for their actions while simultaneously showing the horror of their choices. Kazan doesn't soften anything. The violence is brutal and psychologically motivated. The film examines how war teaches men that force is the proper response to any situation. The commanding officer struggles to understand what his men became. This remains one of the most confrontational examinations of how combat fundamentally rewires human neurology toward aggression and predation. Number 10. Coming Home, 1978. Hal Ashby created one of the finest American dramas ever made about a veteran coming home paralyzed from the waist down. Jon Voight gives an Oscar-winning performance as Luke Martin, a vet navigating life in a wheelchair while his wife falls in love with another man. Bruce Dern plays the conventional Marine officer husband away in Vietnam. The film treats the relationship complications with genuine complexity. Neither Luke, nor the wife, nor the husband are villains. They're just humans navigating unprecedented trauma. Voight's performance captures the psychological devastation that parallels the physical disability. Coming Home arrived in 1978 as Vietnam became history rather than current events, allowing artistic examination without raw political immediacy. The film swept major awards, but somehow disappeared from cultural conversation. Critics and historians often overlook it while celebrating male-centered war films. This remains one of the most empathetic examinations of how warfare damages the capacity for love and connection. Number 11. When You Comin' Back, Red Ryder, 1979. Jon Voight gives a terrifying performance as a drifter with severe PTSD in this brutal film about a waitress, a Vietnam vet, and a small-town cafe. Voight's character is explosive, unpredictable, and dangerous in ways that feel inevitable rather than sensationalized. The film examines how random encounters can become explosively violent when combat-trained individuals lose emotional regulation. The cinematography traps viewers in a confined space with escalating menace. Director Milton Katselas refuses to provide escape or redemption. By the end, everyone's fundamentally damaged. This operates as a chamber-piece horror film where the real monster is psychological damage made manifest through human behavior. Number 12. Sir, No Sir, 2005. While technically from 2005, this documentary examines the almost completely forgotten military rebellion that helped end the Vietnam War. Thousands of soldiers refused orders, deserted, or organized from within the military against the war itself. This story got buried beneath standard narratives of anti-war protests. Sir, No Sir explores how GIs themselves became the war's most effective opposition. The documentary reveals institutional amnesia about this crucial history. The government essentially pretended the military rebellion never happened, removing it from official records and public memory. Number 13. Gabriel. Over the White House, 1933. Actually, Kidding. We need one more legitimate 70s film, so let's acknowledge the existence of Hail Hero from 1969, often excluded from Vietnam War film lists, because it focuses on a young man refusing to be drafted rather than examining soldiers. But it remains crucial cinema about how America's youth rejected the war. Michael Douglas plays a college student wrestling with conscience while his conservative father pressures him toward military service. The film captures the generational divide about Vietnam's morality. It arrived before the cultural consensus shifted against the war, making it a marker of when Hollywood began questioning American interventionism. These 13 films got buried because they refused to provide cathartic narratives or patriotic redemption. They show a war that destroyed everyone it touched: soldiers, civilians, families, entire nations. The studios preferred glossy blockbusters where violence feels purposeful. These films argued violence was purposeless. The culture moved on. Veterans got forgotten. The trauma got normalized. But the cinema remains, raw evidence that some filmmakers refused to look away. Now here's the question that should haunt you. Why do we forget these films but remember the blockbusters? Are we afraid of what this cinema reveals about ourselves? Sound off in the comments with your favorite Vietnam War film, especially if it's one nobody's heard of. If you think this video exposed something important, subscribe so you never miss cinema history getting resurrected from the graveyard.